slide to be fully presentable. Thank you all for coming, especially during this government shutdown. I was on leave before then, so I can be here. So thanks for coming to listen to my book talk on aid dependence in Cambodia, how foreign assistance undermines democracy. Just to provide some context, I teach at the Naval Postgraduate School, where my students are typically junior military officers, 03s, 04s, majors, captains in the Army, not the Navy, obviously. And they've gone to war, to Afghanistan and Iraq, and they're very good at breaking things, but they're not so good at actually building them back up. And the courses I teach them have to do with post-conflict reconstruction, how to rebuild countries after wars. Oftentimes they want to know how to just get the A through Z list of rebuilding countries, and I tell them there's really not a nation building for dummies guide. But too often the attitude is, how do we do the blueprint for a country? And it's not going to be as easy as certainly building a house, or even planning on how to build a house, or even if you can put together a death by PowerPoint graph of what the counterinsurgency dynamics in Afghanistan. And actually, I think some of this, of course, makes sense. I mean, it all supposedly feeds into reasons why the central government doesn't get the support that it needs. But the lesson that I give them is really one of gardening as metaphor, which is really one of how we have to essentially rely on knowledge from locals, because they know best what the weather is like, what the soil condition is like, when to prune, when not to prune, and that it's this illusion of control that they have to give up. Gardeners have no illusion of control. We create the right growing conditions, nurture a healthy soil life, set up our lifestyle so we have to tend our crops, and we plant diverse varieties of sturdy, healthy plants and watch them grow. We adjust as we go along, removing excess weeds, mulching, watering, and fertilizing when necessary, and picking off pests. But ultimately, the end result almost always includes crop failures and unexpected successes, and we feel more like stewards, sometimes even observers, than masters of our domain. So that's my my point to them, and I want to share that with you. Of course, what I do with my plants is more like this, which is to say I'm not very good at gardening myself. But a couple of years ago, The Economist had a piece on genocide and started off with a quote from me, actually. No less than the act itself, the politics of genocide can be heartbreaking. And I think, the context of this is really one of this book is about a personal sort of journey, my own journey of growing up as a refugee, but also, a country's journey. And how did I get to where I am? I mean, I'm a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent trustee of the Nathan Cummings Foundation. How did I get interested in Cambodia? Well, obviously, there's a personal reason for that. A few years ago, I had the distinct honor of giving a TED Talk, and it was the story of my mother's escape and survival and how she saved her 5 children and herself from the killing fields. And the great thing about that opportunity was that Mom was actually there in the audience with me at the end of the talk. She got a standing ovation. My wife, Chamnan, 8 months pregnant at the time, was also there, along with some very important people who got to enjoy, I think, this story of my refugee experience. But, I had the feeling even then that she was getting on with age. She was 73 at the time. Maybe she wouldn't have that much longer, and little did I know how right I was, because 6 months later she passed away. And so some of the lessons from her life are the ones that I try to share in the book that I've written today. So Cambodia certainly looms large in my life. It's where my parents lived in 1969. We had a home that today I got, a couple of years ago I got the chance to visit. It's occupied by 10 families now, but it was a grand mansion. The country itself, known as the Pearl of Asia and an island of peace for a long time, was certainly, I think, an example of how perhaps nation building could be done, because Lee Kuan Yew went to Cambodia to learn from Prince Norodom Sihanouk in 1965 about nation building. In Phnom Penh, the buildings were grand. The cinema was driven in large part by the Prince. Here, I think, in the premiere of The Little Prince, his version of The Little Prince. But across the world, of course, President Nixon was pointing to Cambodia on a map, and he had this to say about Cambodia and his Nixon doctrine. There are no American combat troops in Cambodia. There are no American combat advisors in Cambodia. There will be no American combat troops or advisors in Cambodia. We will aid Cambodia. Cambodia is the Nixon doctrine in its purest form. What did that mean? What does that mean now to those of you who lived that time? Don?
Well, we did have advisors, they just didn't call them advisors.
Right, exactly. And
equipment delivery team.
Right, and this is the kind of equipment delivery team that we I think were secretly sort of doing at one point. But of course, we can talk about it in terms of coming to democracy or not. But the effects of that experience are dramatic. I mean, half of Cambodia here shows up as in red because 113,716 sites were bombed. More, some say, in tonnage than in World War II Europe or Nagasaki and Hiroshima, all of World War II Japan. So a lot of bombs were dropped on Cambodia during this period of time. And of course, on April 17, 1975, the country, Phnom Penh, the capital city, fell. And I think the people certainly living at that time were happy because there had been war for so long. They thought that the only thing that could happen would be the end of war, and so there was some rejoicing initially. And of course, it didn't last very long because one side won and the other lost. And the Khmer Rouge certainly took quickly control and evacuated the city, including my family, among the 2 million people living there in the course of 3 days in an exodus that I think was really quite dramatic because people were in hospitals. They had to simply be left and left to die, and ending up in labor camps that were sort of like, I suppose, what North Korea is experiencing now. So the leaders of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot here on the left, never, some of them, a couple of them are now facing justice, but really most of them escaped. Pol Pot died before really facing any kind of independent judicial process. So the impression I want to give, of course, those of you who are familiar with Cambodia will not be surprised by this, but there's a quote that I used from Michael Paternity, who writes, "Once upon a time there was a regime so evil that it created an anti-society where torture was currency and music, books, and love were abolished. This regime ruled for 4 years and murdered nearly 2 million of its citizens, a quarter of the population." Now, 2 million people, it's a large number. It's hard to fathom. It seems like a quarter, 1 out of 4 people. So let me bring it down to a certain more manageable level, to a place called Tuol Sleng, which was a high school or a school in Cambodia and turned into a torture center, where up to 16,000 people died behind barbed wires and classrooms turned into torture chambers on beds and medieval-looking devices that essentially caused people to confess, even mothers with infants, for their crimes, oftentimes accused of being both CIA and KGB at the same time. And these were children, many of them, guilty of crimes against the state, against ANCA, the organization, and ending up in killing fields. So this is where my book essentially takes off, and where I try to essentially lay the setting of what happens to Cambodia in this post-war period. So Vietnam invades Cambodia in 1979. The invasion is both liberation and occupation, and lasts for 10 years. And it isn't until the end of the Cold War, on October 23rd, which is going to come up very soon, that the agreements on a comprehensive political settlement of the Cambodia conflict, also known as the Paris Peace Accords, are signed. And in this picture from the signing, Prince Sihanouk, the survivor, is back in the helm, and again, in the middle of the picture, actually, you see all the main actors here. Prime Minister Hun Sen there, Khieu Samphan, who is on trial now in the tribunal, all there in 1991. The UN sends in peacekeepers and forms the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, which is, at that time, the largest UN peacekeeping mission ever, a couple of $1 billion. Of course, reviews of what UNTAC was able to accomplish vary. It was at one point seen as a success. I think more sober assessments have had it as perhaps a mixed success. In Siem Reap, there's a Cambodian Cultural Center, and there's a kind of these wax figures there. So the period of UNTAC is shown as this, essentially. I don't know if you can, Lily. What is this? What do you think is happening here?
Well, I guess the start of prostitution as a mass scaling of prostitution.
Right, a kind of brothel explosion, karaoke bars. And the late Richard Holbrook, as a private citizen, had visited Cambodia in 1992 and seen all this. He saw the great work that UNTAC was doing, but also at night how the peacekeepers, some of them were getting drunk and going to these brothels, and how this could spread AIDS. So he wrote a letter to Yasushi Akashi, the special representative of the Secretary General, about this. Never got a reply. At a subsequent, I assume, press conference, Akashi was asked about, this business of the brothels and the peacekeepers, and he said, boys will be boys. I think a reaction that really was disappointing, because it didn't take responsibility for, we've got to do something about this now. But the real scene I want to set is one where in that same period, Akashi and his force commander, I think Sanderson, were trying to enter a Khmer Rouge-controlled area, and a bamboo pole manned by a teenage Khmer Rouge soldier stood in their way. And instead, they had full authority to go anywhere they wanted in the country, but for the fact of this bamboo pole. And instead of actually saying, we have the authority to go in, we will go in if we want to, they turned back. And I think it showed for the world to see, and certainly for the Khmer Rouge to see, how little resolve the UN had in terms of standing up to the Khmer Rouge at that point, and subsequently, of course, to other events that took place in Cambodia. So the 93 election leads to the first ever dual prime ministership of Prime Minister Hun Sen and Prince Norodom Ranariddh. Ranariddh as first prime minister, Hun Sen as second prime minister. You can just imagine what happens when you have two tigers on a mountain. Only one of them will end up surviving. And of course, in 97, a coup happens in which Ranariddh is removed and replaced by a sort of a token figure, Ung Huat, his foreign minister, from Funsn Pek, but now basically subservient to Prime Minister Hun Sen. Fast forward to 2000, 2010, and I should say a couple of $1 billion later in foreign aid, and you have a picture, I think a much clearer picture of what essentially has happened to Cambodia. One of the statistics from my book using World Bank data is that from 2002 to 2010, in a period of 8 years, the amount of government spending to net foreign aid was essentially 94.3%. So for every dollar that the Cambodian government spent, it received 94.3 cents on the dollar. And that's a high level, I would say, of aid dependence. It's not the highest. There are countries in Africa that get hundreds of percentage wise in terms of their government spending. So there's way more spending happening, or way more foreign aid coming in than the government actually spends or controls out of its budget. But at the same time, what you have is also this picture here of corruption, because a lot of the money that would have gone into tax revenues to increase government spending is instead diverted into, I would argue, corruption. So 300 to 500 million was an estimate of the level back in the mid-2000s. I would argue that was even then probably a low number, but even now would be much lower than one would imagine, given the size of Cambodia's economy. And so that explains, I think, where some of that money is instead diverting towards in terms of where tax revenues are, instead of going into government coffers, going into private pockets. And I think the argument here would be one of how essentially, foreign assistance allows governments to tax their people less because they're receiving this aid and are able, as a result, to substitute that money and not essentially go around collecting taxes as much. So there's a substitution effect happening. In terms of, and of course, in terms of democracy, that has really bad implications because, democracies work on the basis of accountability, and if you're not really listening to your people because they're not paying taxes, then that's a problem. But in terms of development, what essentially happens? Now, it's hard to really, it's like catching a falling knife. I'm not able to really determine what's happening because a lot of changes are happening in Cambodia's economy and in its human development indicators at the same time. But one of the interesting statistics from, at least at the time that I put the book together, was that maternal mortality, which is really strange given that you have development happening, has increased. So from 2000, it was 440 deaths per 100,000 live births, increased to 470 plus in 2004, then dropped to about 460 in 2008, but is still higher than in 2000. So while development is happening, there is seemingly this, or growth is happening in the economy, there's seemingly a lack of progress in maternal mortality. And of course, in terms of inequality, you see the Gini Coefficient go up. So 0.38 to 0.42 to 0.44. Gini Coefficient simply measures sort of the level of inequality, and if you have a country that has a Gini of 1, it means that one person has got everything. So that's not where you want to go, going up on these levels. And it's on par with the Philippines and the DRC. Now, what happens to democracy and governance during the same period of time? If you look across a number of indicators of governance, here I'm using the World Bank's World Bank governance indicators across these 6 measures here. The bottom line essentially is that the only trend that you can kind of see as generally improving, because everything else is more or less muddling through or decreasing here, is political stability. And political stability certainly it can be said to have improved only because you have a situation where the same man has been prime minister for close to 3 decades. And here is an older, now dated sort of a network map of sort of the structure of the relationship between the prime minister here in black, Prime Minister Hun Sen, and his in-laws, who are more or less in control of critical parts of the government. So the minister of the Council of Ministers, Sak An, is an in-law through the marriage of his daughter, or rather son, to the daughter of Prime Minister Hun Sen. And you've essentially got a picture here of these relationships, critical people like the Minister of Interior and others. The only update that I can point out immediately certainly is Hok Lundi, who was killed in the helicopter crash. He was the National Police Commissioner, but he was replaced by another in-law of the Prime Minister. So you have a very sort of a stable situation, I suppose, through marriage. And you don't just enter government; you marry through government in that sense. I've been talking at a very macro level, so it's very hard, I think, to understand sort of what's happening at the micro level. So I want to talk about 3 cases, and they're not necessarily cases that I go into deeply in the book, but I do mention them, and I want to just caveat emptor if you're hoping that every chapter is going to be one of these cases. I think the first couple might be, but the third isn't. So let me talk about the rule of law as one example. I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with this idea of protection of property rights, and I think it's generally a good thing, except when it gets twisted. So the case in point here is of Bangkok Lake, which I'm sure some of you have heard, from 2008 to 2012. This lake in Phnom Penh had 20,000 people around it, living around it, 3,000 to 4,000 families. Thanks to Google Maps here. It's in a prime location, and of course became a target of acquisition for a private company associated with a ruling party senator, sold to him by the municipality of Phnom Penh. Now, this lake, of course, has all of its ecological purposes. When the monsoon season comes, there's an outlet for additional water to go to. I think having a body of water in the city is actually a good thing if you can preserve it. Of course, it got bought. It got filled in. Now, of course, from this perspective, it doesn't look like much. It seems like you just filled it in with dirt, and you've got more land to build condos and shopping malls on. But the way that it got done, and the only way it could get done was to essentially take mud from the river next to it and pump it into the lake. So houses around the lake got flooded in, and of course the occupants of these homes had to find different places. So what compensation was offered? Were they given property rights beforehand? Well, it's of course a bit of an embarrassment for the World Bank as a donor, because the bank at the same time had a land titling project which was supposed to give property rights to Phnom Penh residents, and the bank inspection panel did investigate this and discover that, in fact, the bank had been tricked into not giving land titles to those occupants around the lake. So, as a result, they got a pittance compared to what their properties are worth, and their reaction is normal. They start protesting, and, of course, violence arises and ensues. So that isn't certainly unique to Bangkok Lake. It happens around the country with land grabbing. In 2012, this 14-year-old girl here was killed while trying to fend off security forces who were trying to evict her parents. It's a depressing scene, obviously. Turning to something that's perhaps a little more positive, the garment sector is generally seen as a success story for Cambodia, because it started from essentially next to nothing in 1994, really almost no footprint at all in the Cambodian economy, to becoming 14% of GDP and providing circa 350,000 jobs, as many indirect jobs, and helping overall 1 million people. Now, how did this happen? In 1999, the U.S. and Cambodia agreed to link labor to trade. Better labor standards would mean more exports. You can't just trust the authorities to say we have better labor standards. You have to have some third party proving it. So the key was essentially to have a third party monitor the labor standards and report on them, and this actually worked. This third party is Better Factories, still in Cambodia at this time. The International Labor Organization was providing technical assistance for that. And they would go through different checklists of, things like minimum wage compliance. Only factories that are essentially part of the Garment Manufacturers Association of Cambodia and that participate in Better Factories can export. So technically, that's the valve that's supposed to check all this. But of course, who controls necessarily whether something was made somewhere else and then put in the factory that is allowed to export? Nobody. I mean, no one really knows for sure. But some challenges do remain. Cambodia has been focused on this part of the value chain here, this cut, make, and trim. So they're just cutting textiles. They're not making the buttons or the threads even. So it's very limited part of the value chain. And then they ship out the garments that have been put together. And the result has been really impressive, because you've got essentially $3.5 billion of exports of garments. A dip there during the global recession, but certainly picked back up right afterwards. The interesting thing is that this Garment Manufacturers Association of Cambodia that I mentioned, they're really a key to the success of all this insofar as being able to negotiate with the government. So on their website, I don't know if they still have this on their website, but they did. It was sort of their narrative of how they came into existence. In mid-'96, most of the garment investors coming from such a diverse background as China, Hong Kong, Macau, Malaysia, and Singapore, I mean, that's not that diverse, frankly, but decided to form an ad hoc unit to represent them as a group instead of being singled out individually when dealing with officials from the Ministry of Commerce, which has been charged by the royal government of Cambodia to oversee the export of garments and the issuance of certificates of origin. So if you read between the lines, it's basically saying we got together and we started dealing with the officials directly instead of being singled out one by one and being told, you got to pay this much and you got to pay that much. So in a way, they were able to avoid capture thanks to this greater China connection among themselves. So they're all sort of ethnic Chinese. They're certainly coming from different countries, but they can work together in a way that can lead towards I think a more sort of union sort of manufacturers versus government outcome. So one of these, just to give you an example, one of the garment factory owners says, we negotiate with each government department. You take $10 for inspection instead of $35. We agree. We tell all members the cost negotiated at $10. If not accepting, I refer to GMAC, and GMAC refers to your boss. Some in the private sector don't want their boss to know and cheat the boss. That's another story. But essentially, he's saying, we were able to get it down from, say, $35 to $10 in terms of the cost of inspections. At one point, they actually were talking about doing vouchers instead of just paying money, because vouchers would let them monitor the amount of bribe money that would pass hands. So you give the inspector a voucher, and then he can come to GMAC and get his money. But of course, that was a little too transparent, frankly, for the inspector. So they didn't do that. So case 3 on the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, we know that things have gone kind of wrong there over the course of the last few years. It's what I call norm penetration gone wrong. So norm penetration, what is that? It's the idea that essentially Western standards of justice are going to somehow penetrate the corrupt judicial system of Cambodia and bring sort of judicial independence and due process into the Cambodian context. I would argue that on the whole, it seems that the tribunal has been plagued with problems and isn't causing the penetration of norms from the West, but is instead causing sort of a mixture of corruption and norm penetration, or maybe it's reverse norm penetration. Maybe it's the sort of the bad sort of outcomes of Cambodian judicial systems going into an international mixed tribunal context. I showed earlier slides of that school that was turned into a torture center, Tuol Sleng. This is the gentleman who ran the torture center, Doig. He confessed in 2009 to his involvement in all this, and you would think, case closed. He confessed, but it gets a little more complicated. He was found guilty in, I believe, 2011, maybe 2011, in the deaths of 12,273 plus people, sentenced at the time of his being found guilty to 35 years in prison, reduced to 19 for time already served. Now, I think it's kind of jarring, frankly, to see that. He appealed because he thought it was too long and lost. Because the prosecution appealed as well, and then he finally was sentenced to life in prison. But there was a time when he could have, in theory, if he had, really been sentenced to ultimately 19 years, he could have ultimately maybe come out while still in his possibly, 70s, 80s, or whatnot. So, contrast that to this gentleman here. Who is he? Is he already that faint in our memory that our friend Bernie Madoff, right? So 150 years in prison sentence, right? I would say, didn't kill anybody, but did cause a whole bunch of fraud. But still, it's interesting to see sort of that contrast, not appealing. And then of course you've got the case of the Cleveland man who imprisoned those young women. Ariel Castro, sentenced to life plus 1,000 years, saying he's not a monster, then commits suicide because he can't face the whole prospect of being in prison that long. But you have to really think about who the monster is in these cases, and to put this together in a way that maybe can make some sense, because the judge in the Madoff case, Danny Chin, noted that 20 or 25 years would have effectively been a life sentence. But he reasoned that the symbolism of the longer term was important given the enormity of the crimes. That is really where I think a lot of that international justice perhaps is still not quite satisfying to Cambodians. You have Inhibited, released due to Alzheimer's, now released technically, and she's supposed to stay at home, but she's not in prison anymore. And they did say that if she should get better, she would come back into the judicial process, right? Her husband, Ieng Sary, dead at age 87, never technically, died without being found guilty. So he really isn't technically, the stuff that he owns can't be used as any sort of reparation because he wasn't found guilty. So you've got to think about all that. And I have to think about the sort of the wisdom of my late mother, who, with the 5 kids she saved and their grandkids, saved 21 lives essentially in this process. And how she believed in what goes around comes around. This idea of karmic justice. And how the people who had essentially hurt our family would essentially end up hurting themselves in the end. So as a Buddhist, she certainly thought that, in the end, it'll all be settled. And even if not in this lifetime, then in the next one. So, maybe they'd be reborn as cockroaches in the next life. I don't know. But certainly, in a way, I think she was able to forgive the fact that she didn't get justice in her lifetime. And I would argue that for the 15 million Cambodians now living in Cambodia, this way of coping with the lack of justice in Cambodia allows them to, through karmic justice, through the belief that Buddhism will settle essentially all the injustices that have occurred, allows them to not take revenge upon others. My book's conclusion has a quote from the author Teju Cole. Now, many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with the Coney 2012 campaign, right? Still a distant memory, Coney, Lord's Resistance Army. So, this video comes out, YouTube, 20 days, 85 million times viewed. But really, it's an imploration here that Teju Cole gives to us. There's much more to doing good work than making a difference. There's this principle of first do no harm. There's this idea that those who are being helped ought to be consulted over the matters that concern them. And I would argue that oftentimes, we don't see perhaps the second and third order effects of what can happen when we intervene. And perhaps we need to really ask more genuinely for participation. So maybe a Hippocratic oath to development with a commitment to genuine participation would be a start. Now, I'm sure many of you want to hear about the elections, and I don't have any secret, new information that isn't around. I just want to give you a bit of an update for those of you who haven't been following. But the 2013 election did see essentially an unprecedented sort of turnout in terms of the outcome. So Prime Minister Hun Sen versus the Cambodian National Rescue Party, led by Sam Rainsy and Kem Sokha and others, of course, and their party number 7 there. And they got 55 seats in the National Assembly, at least according to the vote count of the National Election Committee, versus 68 for the Cambodian People's Party. There was, of course, some violence on election day. It's interesting to see where the strongholds are here. I mean, the blue areas are CNRP controlled. They're essentially mostly centering around Phnom Penh and its environs. And then as you get further into the field, of course, where it's more difficult for the opposition to operate, it becomes certainly a CPP stronghold. The trends here are interesting. As you can see, Pham Sinh Pech is basically squeezed out of power. They're in yellow here. This is the royalist, and they got nothing in this last election. And so it's really a question of who now really gets to control the National Assembly. I think the debate is over, whether, the CNRP should get the presidency of the National Assembly. So immediately after the elections, after the opposition rejected the results and held the press conference, they've been doing these protests at Freedom Park where they're confined, but at one point were able to do certain marches around the city. I think it remains to be seen. Obviously, there's a potential for violence. There was violence. There have been deaths, but the National Assembly was sworn in and presided over by His Majesty. So what do we do now? What's next? There are still, the protesters. I think this is not in Cambodia necessarily, but I'm not sure. Anyhow, the message here is EU and US, please help us remove Hun Sen the same way you remove Gaddafi. I think a very strong reliance on outsiders to come in and intervene. And I don't know whether, especially in the context of the current government shutdown here in the U.S., there would be any sort of interest. I mean, Sam Rainsy has now left Cambodia to go on an international campaign to get essentially Cambodia not recognized because of this constitutional coup that he characterizes has happened there. Will anyone get involved? I'm not sure. I'm saying at this point the U.S. at least is kind of busy with other stuff. There's an argument that the CNRP is waiting until the National Assembly has to pass its budget, and maybe it will use the leverage of the fact that the budget was passed without its participation to essentially say that there's no legitimacy here. I mean, you can swear in, but you can't actually pass things that matter like a budget. But we'll have to see. Thank you very much, and I'll take your questions.
And
Sure.
we'll continue the flow.
Fine.
All right. Then let's just go ahead and I'm sure this comprehensive, intensive kind of presentation has raised lots of questions. So please, let's just continue to have a discussion.
Was it right after the elections there was talk in the U.S. about cutting off aid, and then Hun Sen kind of trumped the card, said, go ahead, cut the aid, and then...
Enough talking, just cut it off. Yeah.
And what are your thoughts, comments on that?
Well, I think he learned in '97 when foreign aid really was cut off. This was like what I call the natural experiment, the original sort of what happens if you cut off aid and there's no recourse for the Cambodian authorities. In '97, after the coup, the World Bank, the IMF, bilateral donors kind of pulled and said, we're not proceeding with this. And he learned very, very smartly, hey, he adapts, right? He survived 28 plus years to go find alternative sources of financing. So China became a much bigger player in its player really in Cambodia in terms of foreign bilateral sort of investment aid relationship there. And then where is the U.S.? We're talking about 76 million or something like that. It's small potatoes, and it mostly goes to NGOs, which then means, great, cut it off so that you can kill the NGOs that are like opposing me. That would not be smart. But yeah, I think we've backed ourselves up into a corner in terms of our ability to have leverage over Cambodia. Now, the World Bank did say that after the elections it would re-examine this whole business of suspending new loans to Cambodia after the Bangkok Lake situation, and that was in 2010. So it's been almost 3 years now of no new lending activity, continuing the existing lending activity. But people are, I'm sure, quite concerned that there you're talking about more resources, and will the World Bank take a stand with respect to saying, well, we're not dealing with a full legitimate government because 55 out of 123 seats were not taken by the opposition. Therefore, you're not really dealing with a situation where you have checks and balances. So yeah.
I forgot to. Please identify yourself when you're asking a question. Thank you.
Lily.
Yes, so my name is Lily Sisomat. I'm talking on behalf of myself, not on behalf of the bank. China is providing $1 billion. All the donors combined is less than $800 million.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we cut aid, other people can step in. And in your presentation, actually, we don't know how aid has undermined democracy. But,
right.
And the question is, what's the cost of not helping, and what's the cost of not doing anything?
Well, all right. So
I didn't properly explain the relationship. I should say, so basically the idea is really simple. If you have foreign aid, and foreign aid is incentivizing the authorities, the government, to not tax as much, and taxes are a critical part of how you hold accountable governments by saying, if I'm going to pay taxes to the government, I will expect the government to respond to my needs, as in, like, you should build roads that I can use, you should make schools that my kids can study in, and hospitals that take care of people as opposed to hold them ransom, then the outcome would be that you would have more accountable governments. So democracy in that sense is really accountability in the sense of, you are essentially saying, hey, is the government listening to the people? Because if the government isn't taking enough tax revenues, I think the level of tax revenues in Cambodia is like around 8.5-ish% average of GDP. That is less than the foreign aid that is the official foreign aid. And so, if you're the government and you're looking at, on the one hand, the donors are giving me more than my people are paying in taxes, who would you necessarily listen to? And now, I'm not saying they're listening to the donors, because if they listen to the donors, they would actually do things that the donors want them to do. But they can essentially play a shell game of, well, we're not really going to listen to the people because they're not really paying our bills, and then we're not going to listen to the donors either. And then the difference between how much is paid in taxes and how much should be collected if you were really trying to develop yourself is about that difference, I would argue, in terms of the corruption money. So you need to convert essentially the corruption money into tax revenue so you can actually do development activities with that corruption money. But of course, what government that's been enjoying mansions and luxury goods would say, well, we're going to give all that up and actually take the money and build schools and do good things with it and develop the country? That's a kind of they're deep in a catch-22 situation already. So and the role of China, of course, has been last year was such a display of China's importance in Cambodia in terms of the ASEAN chair, which Cambodia held, and how in July and then in November Cambodia essentially turned and said, we don't want to internationalize. We've agreed not to internationalize the South China Sea problem. That is not even what was agreed to. So you've got foreign policy being essentially commandeered by China in Cambodia, and it's becoming quite an embarrassment, I think, for what is still a sovereign state, right? But I think the attitude I think Sihanouk said long ago that it was easier to have a closer relationship with a country that doesn't share a border with you than it does with, say, Vietnam or Thailand or whatnot, because of course they can invade you. With China, the prospect of an actual invasion seems remote, and so in a way they're more comfortable getting, I think, in deeper with China because they think that it's not that dangerous. There's not going to be like, Cambodia, province of China, but it's certainly increasingly looking that way.
American University. I wanted to know about generalizability, and the last answer that you gave is a very interesting one, because Cambodia isn't exactly a model democracy. So I would actually have assumed that a foreign donor would have more influence, direct influence over transparency than the voter, which is already a pretty amorphous concept, right? I mean, 70% of Americans say they want higher taxes for the rich, and we don't get it. Fine for me, but okay. So I'm not so sure how this really works. If you say it's through transparency, which I would assume foreign donors being more likely or more able to impose. And then the second question following or connected to that is, why is it that this happens in Cambodia and not so much in other countries? Because we know, I'm sure you know, that South Korea, Taiwan were highly aid dependent and turned democratic in not all too long time. And say neighboring Vietnam is not a democracy, but its the Millennium Development Goals, Human Development Goals, very, very high improvement. Vietnam is said to be the best improving country in terms of bringing people out of poverty with a lot of aid.
Right.
So how do these things go together?
Well,
the argument of it's not quite transparency, but more the accountability factor argument. But I agree. I think that what's happened is that the donors are disparate. There are lots of donors. They have only a small impact, except for China, of course. And China isn't interested in transparency, democracy, or human rights, which I think is a serious problem when you're dealing in the context of a country like Cambodia, where, the most glaring example, of course, was a few years ago when 20 Uyghurs were trying to seek asylum in Cambodia. And the day before Xi Jinping, then vice president of China, shows up in Siem Reap, they go on a charter flight and are sent back to China. So, and he signs a $1.2 billion package for Cambodia that's very next day. So there's certainly the wrong players have an inordinate amount of influence in Cambodia that are essentially not interested in the same values as the other donors. Let's say the real outlier.
Is that what you're saying?
Right. I think that generally speaking, China's interest in Cambodia is one of currying political influence in terms of ASEAN and certainly in terms of commercial interests. So when they build something like the Council of Ministers building or something, they're really sending their workers there, and for the Cambodians, it's not that great of a situation because they don't get jobs out of that necessarily. It's a lot of Chinese imported workers who are doing the work 24/7. So that, yeah. And as Cambodia as a case in general, well, I think the lesson there would be, I got to meet Aung San Suu Kyi in June, and she was very interested in making sure that the lessons of Burma would be the lessons of Cambodia would be learned in the case of Burma, whether it be, hey, you can actually you can enter what looks like a democratic process, but then end up in a totally twisted situation where the same person keeps winning, the same party has essentially control over every corner of the government, and so what do you do at that point, and do how do you deal with donors in general when they're interested in all kinds of fashionable development trends and so on, and these change over the course of only a few years. So, with donors, they come in, they've got 3-year, appointments as a resident representative or whatnot. I think that authorities, the Cambodian authorities, are very well aware of that. They know that if they can outlast them for a few years, a new person will come in and will simply say, well, we want to reset the relationship and start all over again, and then you've got the same old wine in a new bottle, essentially. My argument essentially is one where donors are certainly have been shown in Cambodia not to help very much in terms of the agenda of reforming the Cambodian government. They've not succeeded, and maybe the idea of reducing their footprint would encourage the authorities to then rely more on domestic resources. But of course, China being there makes it a problem. Yes.
I'm David Timberman with Management Systems International. I was involved in Cambodia quite a long time ago. Just a couple comments and then a question. First comment is I really like your metaphor of nation building and gardening. I think that's really useful, and I hope that gains some traction within the U.S. military, as it should within development institutions. Secondly, I have a real problem with the title of your book because, as you were just saying, I think it completely ignores the influence of that the regime has relative to donors. Mm-hmm. And you shouldn't be conflating aid dependency. Well, you have to disaggregate aid dependency with all the different dimensions of what that aid involves. Right. I mean, USAID and other donors have been supporting a lot of efforts that, at least theoretically or hopefully, would be strengthening democracy in Cambodia. What you see is a very entrenched, very smart, and now foreign-supported, meaning by Chinese-support regime, that can basically circumvent those efforts. So I think your title is, I understand the desire
Thankfully, I
to be
didn't say
provocative.
the official donors, but yes. I mean,
I
look,
think your title is
Yeah.
a little off the mark. Now, the question is simply, given the improvement in the opposition in the last election, what do you attribute that to?
Well, I think that and on the title, I should say the publisher really wanted that title. I told them I thought it was a little too far. I didn't want to. I'm an academic. I don't want to make statements that are a little too extreme. But it sells books.
So we get that clear. Right?
Yes. On the outcome of this last election, I think that the general consensus was, 7 days before the election, Sam Rainsy returns. 200,000 people show up to greet him in the streets, and not. I think one television station had maybe a minute segment about it. Everybody else ignores it, and you have to compare that to the young people who are maybe on the one hand watching TV and saying, "Wait, this is happening outside my window, yet no one is reporting on this. Oh, I'm getting a Facebook message or a Twitter message about the return of Sam Rainsy and all these people there," and they start to understand that, wait a minute, this is like completely incomprehensible in the context of a media that's controlled or self-censoring, that isn't reporting anything that's happening, that's of value, instead showing more karaoke songs or some sort of soap opera or something as the important material of the day, and they become rather dissatisfied with what's being fed to them. So there was certainly, I think, a youth vote that the authorities did not anticipate, and they did not apparently try hard enough to cater to. And generally speaking, I mean, if you go through the examples I showed earlier, there have been grave injustices happening in Cambodia, which I think are not necessarily, even though the news, the local media does not talk about it. Radio Free Asia, Voice of America certainly covers it, and people through social media can discuss it. And a few months ago, when Subedi, the special rapporteur for the Secretary General, the Human Rights Special Rapporteur, had a talk at Cambodian Mekong University, the authorities or the youth wing of the CPP somehow sent a group of young people to essentially embarrass him, and the reaction that got online in social media was, we totally disagree with these idiots who are doing this to Subedi. And so I think people are getting through social media different messages that aren't being filtered, and so that probably led to this outcome that was admittedly unexpected. And still the opposition feels that imagine if the race had actually been done in a way where they had access to media, they had access to resources without the unfair advantage of the ruling party, where they would have been instead. But of course that's a counterfactual, and what they're arguing at this point is, there's some irregularities in the voting that in the counting process. Of course it doesn't matter how the voting takes place, it's really the actual counting that matters, and that's where they say their seats were stolen.
I'm Isabel Rutherford from Freedom House. I am wondering about the argument about taxes incentivizing the government to listen more to the citizens' needs, because while it's true that if the government was in charge of just citizens' taxes, they would be more incentivized to do that, it doesn't limit the voters' ability to express their opinions about the government during voting times. And as that hadn't been the case in the past few elections, I mean more than that, ever since Hun Sen was elected, how do you explain that? And then attached to that would be the question of, is the incentive structure of voters different in Cambodia, because the way the CPP is set up in the country is strange, and it gives power to those who support them. I mean, I guess that's in other places. But why did it take so long to get to the point of this election that we just had?
I think in a way you've answered your own question, because the resources, of course, not all the corruption money goes into only luxury consumption and mansions and so on. Some of it, of course, ends up being used for political party advantage. So the CPP goes around, generally a year before the election, they begin their campaign of, how shall I say it, buying votes. I mean, currying favor from people. And so it certainly allows them to secure, when I showed earlier this map of Cambodia, the rural areas support. Or certainly, as the further you get away from Phnom Penh, it seems that the more likely you're able to then get for them to have control. And now, the last election, I think, was not this one, but the previous one, 5 years earlier, was interesting insofar as it happened in the context of the Preh Vihear sort of dispute, and that was used to great effect by the ruling party. I mean, the dispute over that temple caused Hun Sen to look like the reasonable guy. Why? Because the Thailand looked like they were really messing with Cambodia in terms of like, well, what's their problem all of a sudden? And so you had a kind of, I think, rally around the flag element to it, where there's something horrible happening on our soil, and people are walking onto our temples and so on, and so the whole dispute over that issue, I think, led people to see Hun Sen and to just set aside the domestic problems of land grabbing, corruption, and all that, and say, well, I stand with Hun Sen with respect to Preh Vihear. So the vote outcome was very strongly in favor of the CPP during 5 years ago. So you can only control people so far in terms of buying their votes, right? I think the CPP has been able to associate development with itself insofar as naming schools, bridges, and things after the prime minister or his associates, and so linking specific acts of development for communities with its resources, even though those resources might not have actually been used for that context, but that certainly buys them something. There's also that element of this whole issue over what happened in 1979, 1980, right? The invasion of Vietnam into Cambodia. There's that liberation or occupation. So that for a lot of people, certainly older generation, that event translates in their minds into we were saved by Hun Sen's people and extension Hun Sen because they came in and kicked out the Khmer Rouge. For their children, however, who did not live through 1979 nor do they remember that, there's more of a demand for, well, we want more of what we see outside through social media as desirable sort of outcomes of development, and not sort of this view of, well, what you've got is already so much better than what you had under the Khmer Rouge. Therefore, you should be grateful for that. Thank you. Yes.
I'm Rohit Mahajan from Radio Free Asia, and our network in Cambodia covers land grabs, political situation, corruption, legal logging, and of course the election extensively, and it's made us, I think, the most popular foreign broadcaster in the country. I mean, how much of a role do you see foreign broadcasters like Radio Free Asia, Radio France International, VOA, in bridging that disconnect that you described earlier in regards to taxes and
I think it's a critical role that these independent media, or at least independent from the authorities, the Cambodian authorities, play in bringing actual relevant news to the people of Cambodia. We know, of course, in the countryside, access to radio is virtually universal. So it's really important that such media be available. In the context of the current media landscape, you are playing an incredibly important role in bringing debate, bringing different views. I mean, you're not just saying, hey, we're for the opposition. You're bringing in spokespersons for the government, and they have to embarrass themselves in making arguments that don't make sense, for example, in terms of why certain things have to happen a certain way. When they explain that they have to have armored vehicles because the floods are coming or something, but it's right after the election, and so is that really the reason why you need armored vehicles at that point in time, or is it to intimidate people, right? So I think there's a recognition that without
without RFA, without RFI, without all these other broadcasters, you would essentially have only a steady diet of whatever the authorities want the people to hear, along with maybe social media helping. But that's, you've got to have internet access, you've got to have a cell phone, you've got to, be able to pay for text messaging and all these things. That costs money. It's not free. Yes.
Just a comment about that one. I think the one that when I'm traveling through Cambodia, a lot of people that I talk to say one thing about having Chinese products is they're cheap radios. So they get to listen to radio.
Oh, right. And of course,
So
they
that's
don't
the one
block
good thing.
the stations that are broadcasting things
Right.
that are critical.
But Jose Collazo, just traveling through, I was wondering about if you can comment or if you have any knowledge about the Cnrp Coalition, because that basically is a coalition between the Sam Ramsey Party and the National Rescue Party. How is that alliance? Is that holding? Do you have members who maybe have one seat who want to go to the parliament?
Right.
So you've got Kam Sokha, head of the former Human Rights Party, and Sam Rainsy, head of the Sam Rainsy Party, creating the CNRP, which, it's hard to say. There are all these crazy counterfeited letters that are occasionally observed, allegedly signed by Kam Sokha, saying, he'd be willing to take his seats over and have them sworn in and so on. We haven't seen it yet. Half the time they're dispelled before they even get out of the gate, because it's clearly nothing that could be real, because it's written up in a way that doesn't make any sense. So I don't think there's, at this point at least, I might eat my own words, but at this point at least, there's not an obvious fracture of this coalition. And I think that we've got to see what happens in the next 2 weeks. It'll be critical, as Sam Rainsy is outside the country campaigning for essentially international pressure, which, as I said, right now it doesn't look like. I would put my bet that that's going to somehow change what's happening in Cambodia. I think the reaction of observers in Cambodia is he should be in Cambodia negotiating with the CPP, not going outside of Cambodia. But that's kind of always been his modus operandi anyways, to go outside. And then Kam Sokha staying in and trying to hold down the fort. We'll have to see. If they were to do something like, not allowing Sam Rainsy to come back in, or breaking up this duo, then there could be serious sort of repercussions, I suppose.
My name is Radha. I'm from Radio Free Asia. Recently there's some analysts that said if Sam Rainsy coming out like that a lot and depend on so much on foreign assistance, foreign intervention into Cambodian politics, that can destroy all the Cambodian integrity, Cambodian reputation in international standard. What do you think about that?
That's an old argument that keeps being used. I think it's kind of like the argument of, don't criticize your own country or your own people or whatever, because it'll make us look bad to the outside world. I would say it's better to be self-critical and to at least admit to failings than to, deny. It's look, in economics, I think in Indonesia, the Suharto at one point made inflation of over 10% illegal. Illegal as in it's illegal to report inflation above 10%. You can do that if you want to. You can control information, but it doesn't mean inflation is not going to go above 10%, right? So at some point, does it make sense, for example, to say, for the sake of growth, for the sake of GDP, we should just continue along the way that we've been doing, and not actually take a hit now in order to make the country better in the future? I think there's a lot to be said about that. There's also, of course, the argument that Sam Rainsy holds a French passport and is therefore not really, true Khmer in the sense of, he's going to put everything on the line and risk it all by giving up his French nationality. These are divisive politics that have reoccurred in Cambodia over the years. We're a country that has lots of refugees everywhere, and there are going to be people who have other countries' passports. And if you say you're not with us, you're the other, then you're excluding, I think, a great part of your heritage that could contribute tremendously to your development. And thankfully, that argument is, it comes back again, goes on again, but it hasn't materialized into an actual sort of policy of, well, we really are going to exclude people now because of citizenship. I think it's a rhetorical argument. Those who find that they want to get rid of or oppose Sam Rainsy and the CNRP would say probably that what he's doing is hurting the country in general. Of course, what he's doing is he's trying to hurt the CPP and trying to put pressure on them so that they give up some of their power. But in the process, would somebody looking at a book with the title of my book say, I'm trying to hurt Cambodia? I'm not trying to hurt Cambodia. I'm trying to make things better so that things can develop there and ownership of development can actually take place, as opposed to a kind of it's somebody else's problem. Let's let the donors take care of it, pay our bills, and let's engage in massive corruption if we can.
That side has been ignored for a while. Thank you.
Tom Lum, Congressional Research Service.
Hey, Tom.
Hey.
Nice to finally meet you.
I have two related, more foreign affairs questions. I've also heard that Hun Sen is maybe kind of a balance, or he actually would prefer to balance China and the U.S. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. I mean, he would like good relations with the U.S. as well. A related question is, to the extent that he does cultivate good relations with China, why hasn't that become a political issue in Cambodia? Because China doesn't have a good, China supported Khmer Rouge, and maybe China's seen as being overbearing and with hydropower projects in the region and environmental problems. So why hasn't it become more of a political issue?
Well, I would say the outcome of the vote probably suggests that some people are seeing a kind of are penalizing the CPP certainly for aligning itself too closely with China, especially in the last year when ASEAN's performance with Cambodia's chairmanship was really marred by that. But I think for the average Cambodian, it'll still be domestic politics, and the perception is going to be how is my life not better than it should be under another government. With respect to his trying to balance the two, I'm sure that what he would love to do is to have all of the benefits of the United States in terms of technical assistance, in terms of weapons, or whatever it is he wants, combating terrorism. He knows that the U.S. is very obsessed with combating terrorism, so that's the one area that he has his son working on directly, so that Hun Manet, who's a West Point graduate, to work on, so that it can be the best handled. But that's I think in terms of relative power, in terms of foreign aid, U.S. is admittedly quite small compared to China. But in terms of garment exports to the U.S., that could be a huge card, and it was a huge card. I mean, in 2005, 2006, one of the reasons I argue, the 4 or 5 human rights, labor rights activists were released was because they it was because of pressure from garment manufacturers through the through I think they have a San Francisco sort of group that does business for social responsibility or something, that wrote a letter to the government saying, we consider these arrests not to be good for our business activities and for our garment buying. So there's leverage there, but the U.S. government does not get involved with the private sector in the sense of telling the private sector, well, you should really punish Cambodia for misbehaving on that front. But that card plays a big role, and I think when Christopher Hill went to Cambodia to technically to dedicate the new U.S. embassy in 2006, which led as it was the gift that Hun Sen gave to Christopher Hill, the freedom of these activists. He needed, I think, probably to only mention the importance of garment exports to the U.S. to signal that we understand what's important for you as well, and we can make your life difficult if we wanted to. So that's certainly an area that isn't played up, but should be, I think.
90% of the export are to the U.S.
Right.
It provides 400,000 jobs, impacts 2 million people. If the U.S., aid is very small, right? But if the U.S. just close access to the U.S. market, it's $4 billion export that is foregone. And how many? The pressure is huge.
Absolutely. So. But of course, under what circumstances could the U.S.
close off access and so on? That's where it gets complicated, because we're in a golden straitjacket, right? Globalization, free trade, all these things, and Cambodia is a member of the WTO. So this was part of its own strategy to kind of get into a situation where things like that couldn't just arbitrarily happen.
Yes, I'm Sarada again.
Can I get another? Sorry, can I get another question from the
Kyle Springer, CSIS. What recommendations would you have for private businesses and industry that want to do business in Cambodia, but want to avoid? They want to do it socially responsibly. They want to avoid. They want to be able to. Compensate people for their land appropriately. What recommendations would you have for doing that? Is it even possible?
Well, first of all, I wish them good luck. And look, in the work on garments, I visited Island Clothing, right? This is the highly touted factory that the president of the World Bank at the time, Peter Zalik, went to visit. Everybody who comes through town visits this garment factory, and I would say, they're trying their best to operate within a system that is highly corrupt, where even paying for your taxes. For those who doubt that tax payments are easy, I discovered that paying taxes for these garment manufacturers, for example, paying taxes was so onerous. Like, they won't even count the money. If you bring the money to the tax office and have them take it in, it's too much work, because they're not going to make money from counting your money and writing in the tax ledger. So you have to use services to have the payment transferred and so on, because you'll wait all day to literally get your payment made. That's how little of a connection between the relationship between tax payments and governance there seems to be. But yeah, if a business wanted to do it socially, in a socially responsible way, buy the land without land grabbing, it would be very difficult. I think when I worked for the UN in Cambodia, I knew that when you buy a car, they have to do all the checking, the provenance of the vehicle, because a lot of vehicles in Cambodia are stolen vehicles from California that are shipped to Cambodia and so on. So you want to make sure that you didn't buy some stolen vehicle, but you'd have to have all kinds of due diligence, and it would cost money, obviously, which of course hits the bottom line, and that's not something that you necessarily want to, spare. Anytime you put a filter on your investments, you are going to lower your potential sort of returns on your investment. But I think, for somebody who wants to do that, follow the Foreign Corruption Practices Act, right? You can't engage in corruption, because you will actually go to jail. And I've got friends who tried very hard to follow those rules, and they could never understand why every time they followed the orders of the inspectors from the Cambodian government and did whatever it is that they were told to do, they couldn't stop the constant sort of, you're in violation of this, you're in violation. Well, why? Because they don't have somebody working on their payroll that's actually just there to facilitate and make phone calls to essentially take those inspectors out of the picture. So it's very difficult. Good luck again.
Let's go back to this side.
Ivan Buckelheim from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Given that you were talking about garments and trade as a success story, I wonder what your thoughts are on the upcoming ASEAN regional integration and the RCEP as a free trade deal across 16 countries in the region, and if that might have, I don't know, we have to ask your opinion whether that might have a positive or negative effect.
Well, I think that generally, for a small country, free trade is good, because they don't have market power and they can't really affect prices. But in the context of Cambodia, how many of you even knew that clothing made in Cambodia was somehow, a little less sweaty or sweatshop sort of oriented? A couple of you, right? So you're not buying clothes on the basis of, oh, it's made in Cambodia. I know that it wasn't made under the worst conditions possible, and therefore, most people just buy clothes because it fits them and they like those clothes, right? So there's not that ability to link the special niche area that Cambodia specializes in, this idea of more socially responsibly made clothing, with the actual buyer at the end, where the buyer says, we are interested in buying, clothes that are made from countries that tend not to abuse their workers. I think within the context of ASEAN, opening up additional markets will be good. The main problem I see with any sort of arrangements where even Cambodia's membership with WTO, a lot of concessions were made where essentially you unilaterally disarm and say, okay, we're not going to put up any tariffs. We're just going to be just open like that. And what that leads to essentially is, the decimation of local industry. So in the context of, Taiwan, South Korea, etc., they all had import substitution industrialization initially. They all had some protection to help their industries get up to speed. Of course, the key was, after a while, get rid of them. I mean, don't keep the barriers up, otherwise you'll be non-competitive. And so, what is the balance for a country like Cambodia, and how far can one go? Those countries worked out. They're the lottery winners, but the losers are far more numerous. The ones who essentially got mired in rent seeking, and an inability to go from import substitution to export-led development.
Hey, Andrew Moog from PACT. I was wondering, we talked a bit about the national level democracy development, but I was wondering if you had looked into the more local democracy development, at the commune level, or the recently created structures around the district level, and whether that's changed over time, or has it stalled, and sort of what's been the effect of decentralization on democratic development?
Right. I don't know as much about that. I will say that essentially it's often touted as this great success story of, look, the authorities were willing to give up control over the commune level. And I think, generally speaking, yes, they were willing to put it to a vote, but I think after the first election it was clear that the outcome was 99 or 98% or whatever of the seats ended up being controlled, because the way you organize the vote counting, the way you apportion the seats, it tends to bias sort of the party that's got already, I think, a large sort of control over the geographic area. They expose themselves to some pressure from outside, and the argument would be that even if they ended up winning the seats before the election and perhaps after the election, the CPP would change certain commune councillors because they realized that this person is not popular, this person has been really a corrupt figure in the community and needs to be replaced with somebody else. There's some internal sort of checks and balances or internal accountability being argued there. But I would say that internal accountability is better than no accountability, but it's still, I think, far less preferable to actual competitive sort of processes that lead to real free and fair sort of elections and outcomes.
Return on Cambodian living in the States. Can we come back to the unfinished business of the nation?
Yes.
During the election propaganda, the Cnrp two topics that is part of the platform, one being the border control between Cambodia and Vietnam. The other one, the immigration of Vietnamese into the country. That's what CNRP accused the CPP that they have no control of illegal immigration or to illegally come to the country. Do you have any knowledge or any comment based on that?
Well, I think Sam Rainsy gets criticized as a xenophobic sort of promoting politician because of his use of words that are considered in certain contexts to be derogatory. I think this is very it's a very sort of touchy area because obviously the CPP came to power through the Vietnamese invasion and occupation of Cambodia. So there's a kind of an identity issue there. Then you have essentially international UN sort of elements to the fact that you don't want to use language that's derogatory or considered derogatory, in some contexts could be considered derogatory. I mean, there's politically correct language. So there's the argument that his use of ethnic politics or essentially the word Yuan is seen as beneath the stature of somebody of his level and should be avoided. But when he goes around campaigning, he would use that to kind of get people riled up. But I think it's a very difficult thing. I mean, could he have won 55 seats without resorting to that? Maybe. Maybe it's better to not engage in that kind of politics in order to look as if But then if you become too politically correct, are you then being kowtowing to the other side? So I don't think there's really a solution. Of course, I think the criticism is that the ruling party seems to be obsessed with what's happening with Thailand, but never seems to care about what's happening with Vietnam. So what about some sort of more rational view of Cambodia's border politics and essentially being a little more independent of Vietnam in that sense? So that's also a criticism on that end.
Wei.
Ellen Frost from East West Center. To follow up on the earlier question about trade, Cambodia is not a member of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but Vietnam is. The garment industry is very highly protected. We have the yarn forward rule and a bunch of things. But I just wanted to flag that because it seems to me Vietnam is counting on being a big gainer in TPP, and I would assume that means Cambodia is going to lose them. Just one quick question. I think your emphasis on accountability and taxes is, of course, very valid. Underneath that, there's sort of a broader issue of civic responsibility and not thinking that it's somebody else's problem. I haven't spent much time in Cambodia, but when I did, people were just fatalistic. They just said that's the way it is. We can't change it. We can't do anything. We can just get around it. So I wondered what, if anything, you think is happening in that sort of broader domain of civic responsibility.
Right.
Well, I think part of the problem certainly is that when you bring in essentially donors who even for a work for food program, let's say, you're sweeping something or doing something, the expectation is you're going to get something at the end. You're going to get a bag of rice. You're going to get something because there's an exchange relationship happening. And I think the complaint certainly from abbots of temples that were used to in the pre-sort of intervention period to get people to do things for not for free, not asking for something in return, has become more difficult. So you have a more materialistic view of sort of society that makes it difficult, I think, for people to engage in more of this social capital, which of course was destroyed during the Khmer Rouge period, where people don't trust each other already. So this is not really helping that much when you see it in that context. And I appreciate your point about TPP. Burma is certainly already being looked at as the hot place for garments to go to next. I think that it's going to be a difficult several years ahead for Cambodia if it is to remain competitive in the context of higher wages, strikes happening there, and competition from Burma.
And I'm with the Asia Foundation. What percentage of Cambodians do pay tax?
What percentage?
Actually, we don't have statistics necessarily for that, but I'll tell you that the context of taxation is, wage on their wages, if that's being collected, and for business or corporate taxes in terms of an estimated tax regime, a tax inspector would go to the business, and there would be some sort of negotiation happening, and then at the end there would be an agreement of how much would be paid. But that's where the fact that you've got a relative who's in some high position in government would then lend you the ability to say, well, this money exchange business I run processes millions of dollars per month, but I'm going to pay you $100 per month in taxes. And that happens. It's literally a situation where there's not a relationship between auditing and accounting and how much money, how much revenues are you really making, but a kind of discretionary power that inspectors have.
The reason why I asked this is that about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I read that in Indonesia, only about 3-4% of the population
pay taxes. Yeah.
I mean, they've made some advances in terms of their democratic development.
Right.
Albeit hiccups over the last 15 years.
Sure.
And so it makes. I agree with you about the buy-in with that, and that what Ellen said about promoting civic, responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
But Indonesia also has its problems with corruption, and I'm sure there are similar circumstances where people go and say, "Well, this is what I'm going to pay." Tax collector says, "Well, that's just fine." So, is there any particular model in the world that you think that might be for Cambodia to be able to go along this path?
Right. Well,
so according to at least one scholar, the view that the Prime Minister has of taxation in Cambodia seems to suggest that he has this idea that, I guess under royal times or whatnot, it might have been possible for the king to go to certain rich individuals and collect from them some donations, aka taxes, and thus avoid having to take any tax revenues from the rest of the population, thus sparing them of that, unfortunate outcome. If that's the case, then it means that these donations would be sort of driving a lot of the policies that he wants, because they'd be paying into the treasury the bulk of the taxes, and in a way, I think it's kind of twisted, but because of the low tax revenues that are collected and the low levels of taxation perhaps that people have to pay, they can then engage in the corrupt practices of getting money from people, which of course is not above board and does not get counted in tax revenue. So it's not just low taxes. Oh, if it was just low taxes, it wouldn't be so bad, except for the fact that you don't get the revenues. But then corruption on top, which then allows them to collect, money outside the system.
In American University, just to follow up on this, I didn't want to make my question too long before, so I cut this out. But there is the other side of the story of aid as a backstop for corruption. You don't have to tax. The other side of that is that countries that don't get aid, or if you were to cut off aid, then the government would start taxing other people. In a very poor country, it's very hard to tax a large part of the population. So you have to tax a small part of the population. You get captive to these people, and they would be very few. I don't know about landowners, but say industrialists, there would be very few. So that maybe then a captive government to this small part of the population. Right. That's the other problem that you have, for example, in many resource extracting countries, but when the resource extractors become really the owners of the government. In Latin America, the large landowners. So that's the other side of cutting off aid to become more transparent, and you become captive to a certain part of the population.
Yeah, look, I didn't say I had a perfect solution. I think that the lesson from '97 suggests that when donor funds stopped, they were able to find alternative revenues by, for the first time, introducing a value-added tax, right? So they introduced a broad-based VAT to collect.
It's very regressive, right?
It is regressive, but at least this was the first inexplicable sort of jump in revenues all of a sudden that suggested maybe a change in approach. But after that, you don't see much improvement. So there was recently a land tax finally, and I think this is a good thing because, frankly, a lot of land in Cambodia is grabbed and then made fallow and unused, so that essentially you don't have an outcome where land is being used productively, and so there isn't as much revenue generated from that. So you've got to essentially, I think, make things more costly for those who have the means. I'm not arguing that the poorest people should be taxed. I'm arguing that those who have the means should be taxed, and that corruption should be substituted for actual taxation, if at all possible.
No, I'm afraid we are right at the time when we always promise to be adjourning, and it's painful to do this time because obviously this rich Q&A has shown that we were overdue in giving this attention to Cambodia, and we probably need to return to it very soon. Before I completely bring this to a close, though, let me mention that the book is for sale outside, so please, anyone who's interested in making that purchase, stick around. The copies are available. Second, we are doing a podcast of this, so we have a record of a very rich discussion that I think will be a useful reference point. Third, I need to make a plug for an October 23rd event that we're doing here, another book event that will be Jonathan Adelton, the former ambassador of Mongolia, will be talking about his book on U.S.-Mongolian relations, and that will be on October 23rd. Excuse that little interruption for a future event. But really, I think in the closing here today, I just want to say how much I think this discussion illustrated the timeliness, but also the very compelling subject that we have in contemporary Cambodia and beyond even the whole complex matrix of development assistance. So please join me in thanking Dr. Sophal Ear.